We have roughly 936 weeks with our kids from birth all the way to graduation.
Wow.
And just thinking about that, right? That's kind of a big deal. 936 weeks, that's going to go by in a blink of an eye. So
Mm.
what does that mean? What are the implications of that? It is important for us to show up and not miss those really important moments.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Built Different podcast. My name is Zach Clinton. I'll be your host, and as we continue to grow, I'll have friends joining me each week to interview some of the leading experts in the fields of motivational speaking, mental health, ministry, and even sports. Our goal is to instill hope, encouragement, and motivation in and through your life today. And our prayer is that after each episode, you'd be more equipped and encouraged to look, love, and live more like Christ from the inside out. That's our definition of what it means to be built different. So I hope you're ready. You better buckle up. Let's roll. Dr. Chinwé, my friend, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Zach.
Absolutely, ma'am. You know, we had the opportunity of connecting just very briefly at our most recent Next Gen conference in Atlanta, Georgia on youth mental health. It was an incredible time just getting to meet you personally face to face, to hear you speak. What an incredible keynote you delivered to myself and all of those in attendance. But you know, Dr. Chinwé, as we were just talking, we didn't get to record this there, but there's no greater time than right now in Mental Health Awareness Month. You know, Dr. Chinwé, it's an important time to have conversations just about not just the challenges that people face, but about what it looks like to be mentally healthy, to flourish, to build resilience, right? Attachment, all of these things. Dr. Chinwé, what does Mental Health Awareness Month mean to you?
Oh, wow, Zach. Thank you so much for asking. So this is a time of the year where we are specifically focusing on mental health and wellness and exactly what you mentioned, what that entails and what can actually hinder our mental wellness and well-being. So although it's a month, this is something that those of us in the mental health arena really want people to focus on every single day, 365 days of the year, because it's so important. So Mental Health Awareness Month, for me, it means that we can really be heightened in our awareness around things like chronic burnout, chronic stress, unresolved issues and trauma, things that are uncomfortable, things that many of us would rather not focus on at all. But with all of the education that we're seeing on the media, social media, even sports industries, it's really a time for us to notice that those are the things that actually can impact our overall wellness. And we know that mental wellness is tied to our physical well-being, our emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being. And what a wonderful time to pay attention to it, not just for the sake of our kids, our teenagers, our spouses, our loved ones, but for ourselves. So for me, it's really highlighting that mental health is intricate to all forms of health and well-being.
Absolutely. I appreciate your perspective. And I also, something we've been reminding our listeners and viewers of a lot is that vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is strength, as well as just because somebody carries it well doesn't mean it's not heavy, right? So being able to have these open conversations, this dialogue, to be able to remind us that if you're struggling, if you need help, it's okay to ask for it. It's okay to not be okay, but you don't have to stay there. Dr. Chinwé, one thing that I do know is that relationships sometimes cause a lot of stress, cause a lot of burnout, cause a lot of trauma and wounds.
Yes.
You've done a lot of your research and your work in the field of attachments, especially when it comes to the parent-child relationship. I would love for you just to help our listeners and viewers get a better understanding of what are attachments, number one, but also what's at the heart of just your passion behind this field.
Thanks so much for that. So at the center of attachment theory is this idea that I think so many of your listeners can immediately connect with. So it's this idea that positive early bonds between a child and an important caregiver really does lay the foundation for children to grow up to be happy, to be healthy, to be independent and to be
Yes.
resilient. So at the heart of attachment is this psychological term called attunement. So that's something that maybe a lot of listeners aren't super familiar with. So I just want to break that down because that's really at the heart of the work that I do and why I'm so passionate about really folding in attachment theory in my therapy work and my conversations with parents and families. So at the heart of attachment is attunement. So attunement is basically being aware of and responding to someone else's emotions. So this is actually the process. We take it for granted sometimes, especially when we've got the little ones in our hands, when we're paying attention to their every single need. As they get older and become more independent and more vocal and maybe have their own thoughts and ideas at 13 and 14, that becomes a little bit more challenging, but the concept still remains the same. But it does start very early on when we get to know our children, when we're responding to their cues for safety, their cues for comfort, when we're really attending closely, observing their behavior, empathizing with them. And as they get older, listening to them, even when we disagree, but we're responding in a way where they feel seen, soothed, listened to, and understood. We are finding out through neuroscientific research that that actually helps to promote the healing of lots of challenges in mental health that we're seeing right now among youth. Despair, depression, self-harm, even forms of trauma that are interpersonal. So as you mentioned, relationships heal. We know that, but relationships can actually cause a lot of hurt. But God has given us this mechanism of helping to heal that hurt. So attunement, attachment theory is about just setting the stage for our kids to be successful. But we're also seeing research that shows that it helps to promote really, really difficult circumstances and setbacks that not just kids, but that we all experience.
It's so powerful to hear because, attachments are something that I'm incredibly passionate about. My dad's been incredibly passionate about for years. Him and Dr. Sibsey came out with that book, Attachments, Why We Do the Things We Do, right? Yeah. So being able to help us understand the significance of our internal working models that we're developing from that time, like you said, of really, really early childhood all the way throughout our lives and how those things develop and why we do or don't do relationship well. And, one thing that I do know based on my understanding is that there are several attachment kind of styles that people need to be more aware of. A secure, but also there are several insecure. Dr. Chinwé, would you mind kind of giving our listeners and our viewers a better understanding of those styles and how they can be developed and the impact they have on our view of self and others?
100%. So, and love that your dad provided us with this information, especially in the space of faith, how it integrates with our faith, right? Because God created all good things, and this is an amazing thing. So, attachment styles essentially are patterns of behaviors and interactions in relationships that are established, as you mentioned, really, really early in childhood, through infant caregiver relationships, but really last into adulthood. So what's interesting is that these styles and patterns can actually predict behaviors later on in life. So the research has identified 4 major styles of attachment. And so the very first one, and the one that we are all striving for our kids, is secure attachment. So babies who form secure attachment to their primary caregiver, they're more likely to be adults who are confident in themselves. They are resilient. They are able to seek out healthy relationships with others. And this is like such a big deal when it comes to just families. They're able to be reliable and dependent and loving partners to their spouses. And so the way that this forms is when, again, a caregiver is responding to those cues of safety and connection and comfort that babies offer very, very early in infancy. And so what that looks like to have secure attachment in an adult relationship is pretty much this. If you are secure, you are able to form a long-lasting, healthy relationship and be emotionally available to your spouse or to your loved one. Does that mean that you're not going to have ruptures? No. Does that mean that you're not going to have difficulties or misunderstandings or setbacks in your relationship? Absolutely not. But what that means is that your parents, right? Your parents, through secure attachment, those early bonds that were formed, set the stage for you to be emotionally available for repair. And at this point, the research shows, I've seen it a little bit higher, but the research shows that about 58% of adults are securely attached. So that's the good news, is that most of us have secure attachment. So that's what we're aiming for. There's another attachment style, and let me know if you want me to,
Absolutely.
just go through a couple more, but the next one is anxious attachment. And so this is also identified in the literature as preoccupied attachment or anxious ambivalent attachment style. So this is an insecure. Everything after this is insecure attachment. So this is a form of insecure attachment that forms between a baby and a caregiver when the baby just isn't sure that that caregiver is going to be emotionally available to them.
Yes.
Right? So they cry, and maybe the parent or caregiver comes in once and they cry again. And maybe that parent and caregiver is so distracted and preoccupied with the stress of caregiving or the stress of work or the stress of just living. It could be a number of reasons why parents aren't able to provide secure attachment on a consistent basis. But regardless, what that baby is feeling is, can I really trust that someone, anyone, is going to respond to me when I'm in a state of distress? So anxious attached babies learn very quickly that they may or may not get the care, the attention, the comfort that they need. So what that means later on is that they may not be easily comforted by an adult who's trying to do everything that they can to, walk alongside them in their pain. That individual who's now not a baby, but an adult, may be thinking that I could be abandoned at any point. So, so that's the crux of it. And I think the research shows about 19% of the US population of adults have anxious attachment style.
It's important to be able to recognize several of these attachment styles because, like you said, they impact how we view ourselves, but also how we view other people. So how we do or don't do relationships. And these are so important to understand because they really are rooted in this understanding of, is there that emotional availability and attunement to the child from a young age? And if there is, it can develop that secure attachment. But if there's not, it definitely can, influence the insecure attachment, not just in a child's upbringing, but all throughout their life. And so as you recognize this, Dr. Chinwé, you said the word distraction and preoccupied. And I think about the culture that we live in today. Those two words are at the forefront of it all. And I think, this thing right here, a phone, is a huge contributor to those things, right? Not just in the parent-child relationship, but in even the marital relationship. Speak to the things that, as you're on the front lines, are working against this connectedness that could lead us closer to secure attachment.
Yes, I love that you just brought that up. Some of us are familiar with the report that came out last year by the U.S. Surgeon General's office, indicating that loneliness is the new epidemic.
That's right.
So this was and I just want to say that, especially in the field of mental health and youth mental health, stats can be super duper scary.
That's right.
And I sometimes have to share them because we want to see the reality of what's happening. But I think it's also important to be responsible in letting people know that there is a gap between when studies are conducted and when the data is released, right? So the hope is that there's been some improvement, but sometimes these stats can be scary. So I'm not going to give you a hardcore stat, but what I will say is one of the primary takeaways from this really long and extensive report is that people are lonely. And I'm actually feeling really tearful talking about it because I see this in my work with families all the time. People are lonely in their marriages. People are lonely in their neighborhoods. People are lonely in their communities. I had a parent say to me that, her child had a recital this spring, or not a recital, I'll say a tournament this spring, and she was going to be in a hotel room. It was out of town. She was going to be in a hotel room with her child, but with other mothers. And she said that she had such fear and trepidation about whether or not she would be able to bond or connect with the other parents because she's been out of practice for so long and feels really lonely in her community. And her child has these relationships, but she doesn't feel like she has a connection with the other parents. So she was really nervous. So a lot of our work was about reminding herself that she's not that 15-year-old girl that wasn't invited and wasn't included and wasn't chosen. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot. But the bigger picture is that this report indicated that loneliness was, so deeply impactful and consequential that it related loneliness to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day in terms of the effects that it has on your body. So including, just early mortality. Can you imagine? So when you ask the question about, what's sort of, contributing to disconnection, 100%, I would say the shifts in our culture that include the high prevalence of smartphones and digital technology usage that we need and we're so grateful for. And thank you, Lord, that we had it during the pandemic. And thank you, Lord, that we have it right now to be able to disseminate important information to families, right? But with anything, right, it could be overused and misused. Right now, we know that 95% of teenagers report that, this is according to a Pew study, report that they have a social media account. 95%. Just a few years ago, before 2022, it was 81%.
Wow.
So our kids are overly connected using digital devices, but the truth of the matter is that we are too as adults, and it is impacting our relationships with our spouses. It is impacting our relationships with our kids. And if you think about it, if you think about it, that's really how it was designed, right? The digital devices that we all kind of consume on an everyday basis, it's designed to keep our attention, right? Those notifications, those dings, it does something, it increases our dopamine. And so we're like kind of excited about it. It's like, okay, like what happened? What's new? It makes it difficult for us to concentrate. It actually impacts our cognitive processing and functioning. It leads to decreased, productivity. I talked to corporate spaces about that, but it also leads to increased stress. So once again, if we're preoccupied, I'm going to take a sip. If we are preoccupied with everything that's going on in the world vis-a-vis this phone or our TVs or our laptops, what are we not doing, right? We're not connecting. How many of us have seen those families at the dinner table at restaurants, actually, and every single member is looking down at their phone? When they could be bonding. So it's a big deal. And we actually point to our kids, but we really are the models. And I'm guilty of this at times too. So there's a study that says over a quarter of parents report that they are addicted to their smartphones. So what would it look like if we all made one tiny change in our families as adults to model just new behaviors? Technology isn't going anywhere, but we know that it's contributing to a lot of things that we really don't want and that's impacting our ability to connect.
I love that you brought up loneliness because we've chatted a lot about loneliness on the podcast in weeks and months and even years prior, talking about just the negative impact it has on our lives and how challenging it can be to overcome. I interviewed a guy named Justin Whitmell early who wrote a book several months ago called Made for People. And he talks about how we were made to love and be loved. We were made for relationship. The very first thing that God said was not good was for man to be alone. So we have to have these relationships. But I was reminded in his book that, in a sense, isolation and loneliness, it's the invisible illness of our day and age, and it's always the
Mhm.
undiagnosed illnesses that are the most dangerous and deadly. And how he
Mhm.
defined loneliness was so unique, because a lot of us, when we hear the word loneliness, we typically think of, oh, those people that are hermits that aren't getting outside of their homes. But how he defined it was someone who used to have friends, in a sense, someone who maybe doesn't prioritize those relationships anymore. And how I kind of view it now is not just somebody who's surrounded, but somebody who feels supported, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people who are maybe listening that have people all around them, Chinway, but
Yeah.
they don't feel supported. They feel
Mhm.
isolated. They feel like they're on an island. They're doing everything alone. And,
Mm.
I'm aware that there are some people out there listening today that they're asking the question, Dr. Chinway, well, then how do I spark this secure attachment? How do I press into relationship rather than continually pull away? And that's where I kind of want to shift here in our conversation, because at their Next Gen conference, you spoke on 4 critical components that I believe will help us be able to develop that secure attachment again, whether it be with our spouse or whether it be with our children. The first phrase that you bring up is being able to show up for whoever it is, our spouse or our child, before they ask us to or before they expect us to. Dr.
Yeah.
Chinway, speak to the importance of simply showing up.
Wow. Yeah. And it seems so simple, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
seems so simple. But as I always share when I'm talking to families, this is a tool that we wrote about in our book, Seen, as
Yes.
the very first tool for connection, because it's foundational. All of the other tools hinge on this tool. So we always say, if you don't remember anything else, just remember to show up.
Mm.
And that really is the catalyst. So the principle is really based on this as parents. So I was a school counselor at the high school for many years, and I really was proud of the connection that I formed with young people. I was head of certain committees. I did SGA. I was the step team coordinator for many years. And so that was really fun. I traveled with my girls. I had deep relationships with the folks that were on my caseload, but also other kids in the school. I had a level of influence that I was really proud of, and I could speak to kids in a different way than maybe their parents could. But here's the bottom line. Parents, your influence is greater
Mm.
by a country mile. And so 936 weeks with our kids from birth all the way to graduation.
Wow.
And just thinking about that, right? That's kind of a big deal. 936 weeks, that's gonna go by in a blink of an eye. So
Mm.
what does that mean? What are the implications of that? It is important for us to show up and not miss those really important moments. And when we talk about showing up in the book, we talk about showing up and slowing down. And we talk
Mm.
about how absolutely we're recording in May. It's a really busy month for families, for educators. There are fun things that are happening, recitals, graduations, spring tournaments. Our kids want us to show up for those things.
Yes.
Absolutely, right?
Yes.
And this is me talking to my teenagers that I've counseled for years and years. They want us to be there for those big important moments, but they also want us to be there for those seemingly insignificant, mundane moments where you're just kind of hanging out, you're playing ball in the front yard, you're taking your 15-year-old daughter or niece to get a latte, or you're going to your 17-year-old's favorite artist doing a concert, like those things where you're not necessarily teaching or lecturing or providing important life lessons, which we as parents, I know I do. I feel like I'm always looking for those avenues to teach something. Our kids want us to just be there. And then we just talked about the importance of slowing down without our devices, because that just gets in the way of connection. And there's a study that I saw that showed just putting your phone away. And for parents who have these really important jobs, I get it. Put your phone on airplane mode. We've seen studies that show that that increases presence by 30%. So the bottom line is showing up. during those big milestone moments, or when your child is in deep distress, we go into mama bear and papa bear mode, and that's important for them. And they need you there, but they also need you to show up when there's just 5 or 10 minutes walking to, I have a 10-minute walk to the bus stop with my son, my 9-year-old, and he shares some really big things with me during that walk. For your listeners, that might be that 5 minutes before bed, or when you're just peeking into their room. And this is important for teenagers as well, where you're just saying, hey, I love you and I'm proud of you. And is there anything about your day that you want to give to the Lord? Is there anything about your day that I can support you around? And by the way, if it's a teenager, they're probably not going to go to bed for 2 more hours. So we'll be sleeping before they will be. But those consistent check-ins, that's what my clients tell me. That's what the research is showing is really important.
I love that, because I think about my dad, and my mom and dad both were so consistent in showing up for me. I played sports a lot growing up, and so they weren't just there for the big games or the championships, but they were there for practices, Chinwé. My dad, right, he would be so busy, and he would sacrifice so much to do those red eyes, or to be down in Florida one day at 5 a.m. flight and be back by 5 p.m. to pick me up, right, to be there.
Wow.
And I so appreciate that, because as you talk about showing up, I think of what that gave me, what that offered me as a kid. It gave me confidence, right, because of their consistency, and it made me feel like, what, I was valuable. And I was loved. And I was also, the second piece, I was seen, right? You talk a lot about seeing our kids.
It's good.
And that's beyond the physical, right? We're talking about the emotional now beneath their behavior. Can you give us some strategies as to how we can more effectively see our children on the road ahead?
Absolutely. So when we are teaching our kids, and even discipling our kids in terms of providing education and information, that is important, and we need to keep doing that. But that activates the left side of the brain. What we are learning from neuroscience and neuroscientists is that despair, distress, fear, trauma, anger, all of that happens on the right side of the brain. So to see your child means holding off. This is a very practical, but I think simple but important strategy, holding off on teaching, lecturing, reminding for a moment to really see that emotion. Because oftentimes what we're attending to is those really big off-putting behaviors. And let me tell you, I've worked with teenagers since the beginning of my career, and now I've got 2. They will push every single button, and it's so easy to go into that mode of teaching and correcting and reminding. And again, those things are important. But when a child is experiencing heightened distress, and this could be a 2-year-old or a 22-year-old, what we are noticing in the research and what I do in my therapy room is I meet them right brain to right brain. So what that means is really understanding that those emotions feel really big to them, and me telling them that, no, that's not going to happen. That fear is not logical, or, oh my goodness, like, aren't you being dramatic? I may be thinking all of those things,
Right,
because I'm human. But that's actually not going to help them in that moment. So what really helps them is for us to pause, resisting the urge to really say the things that we're thinking or to respond in anger. Research tells us that it just takes 10 seconds, right? This is a really important tool. 10 seconds of pause helps us to go from reaction to response, right? And they may look at you like you're an alien, like, what, are you going to say anything? Like, why are you quiet, right? But that's really big. That pregnant pause is what we want. And then we notice, okay, this is the behavior, but what emotion might be driving that behavior? And we know that in the psychological research, anger, defiance, and avoidance or withdrawal are 3 things that really do push a teenage parent's button. But those are also 3 things that we see in almost every single mental health challenge. So Does not mean that your child is struggling with a mental health challenge,
Right.
but we do need to pause to see what is behind the behavior, the emotion that's really feeling out of control, and then we can help them to cope with it.
It's so good. Make sure that we pause to actually see what's going on behind or beneath that behavior, right? Actually seeing our kids emotionally. And then you talked about kind of pausing for 10 seconds, right? That reminds me of the third one where you talk about just listen. And you're talking about not just listening with our ears, Chinwé, but also listening with our eyes. And I remember you said that down at the Next Gen conference, and that spoke to me because I was like, man, I do that, right? In my counseling sessions, we learned that in terms of empathy. But do I actually do that in my relationship with my wife and with my family, with my nieces? That's a hard one. Speak to the importance of listening with both our ears and our eyes.
Wow. So we have heard, I love that you just said that. And I think the more that we can be transparent as professionals, like we have trained, we've been trained on this. We've read every book. We do it really, really well professionally. But in those really personal relationships, those intimate relationships, there's a lot more emotion and it's high stakes, right? So it takes a little bit more effort and intentionality, but it does work and our families do need it. And I have to remind myself constantly, to respond in the way that I know that works with my teenagers and my adults. So what we know from neuroscience is that communication is not just, verbal. And communication isn't just about, listening in terms of like our ears. 80%, really over 80% of communication is really nonverbal. So neuroscience tells us to be able to connect with another human being, especially when they're in a high state of anxiety or distress, is all about listening to them using our whole body. And so vocal tone is really important. So it's not necessarily about the words that you're saying, it's how you're saying it. So sometimes when I'm talking to families or I'm talking to audiences, I'll give the example of someone saying, "I'm listening." How does that make you feel? It's like, I'm scared. I said it to myself. I just said it and I feel a little bit like, like some tension, right? I'm listening, right? Versus I'm listening. I'm here, and then your audience may not be able to see this, if this is audio only, but I also, made my eyes very gentle. And there's a way that we can do that. Gentle eye contact helps kids and teens to feel safe. And then if this is a relationship that warrants this, we also know from neuroscience that appropriate, safe physical touch, if this is your spouse, if this is your child, placing your hand on their shoulder, rubbing their back. Some kids don't want that in the moment, right? But some kids and spouses, absolutely, that's their love language. And so lean into that. That helps to what we write in the book. It's a hack that helps to reroute the brain back to that time of secure attachment when they felt nurtured, they felt seen, they felt soothed. So it's all about creating emotional safety. And so this is what's important about this tool. You want your child to keep talking. So there are 3 really important words that we write about in the book. I'm just going to share right now. Tell me more.
Come on, Dr. Chinwé. That's so good because I appreciate you talking about vocal tone. You talk about creating that atmosphere of safety because that's something I appreciate about you just in my interactions with you. You make people feel safe. There's a warmth about you that is very contagious. And, I do believe that is just empathy that just exudes out of you. And so I appreciate that about you. I just wanted you to know that personally. But I also love how you talk about, right, showing up, seeing them, listening, and those are the first 3 things that you talk about, right? Because I believe that presence is more important than perspective. The 4th one, though, you talk about, which is typically what we want to jump to right away, is speaking life, right? Encouraging, saying things, giving that, point of view. But how you talk about if you don't do the first 3, it could easily fall on deaf ears. Speak to why those 3 things come before this, but also the importance of how we can better encourage and support our children in the days ahead.
Yeah, 100%. So speaking life was one of those tools that we almost didn't include in the book because it seemed really obvious.
Yeah.
And we know for parents who are Jesus followers, we're pretty good at this. We're
That's
pretty
right.
good at um, helping our children to know that they are made in the image of Christ. We're pretty good. I know early on I would say to my boys, you are, a child of the Most High, and
Mm.
um amazing blessings are coming your way. And so scripture is so full of beautiful affirmations of God's goodness and how God feels about his children. And so I think that comes fairly easy to most of us. And
Yeah.
so I was thinking as we were kind of, going through all of that, because there's like 100 things that you can do that's
Right.
wonderful for healthy child development. But, is this one that we really wanted to include? And we all said yes. Our team was like, absolutely. And my teenagers, because part of the research from this book came from me asking the people that I've counseled throughout the years, what was it that someone who loved you, who was in your corner, what was it that they did when you were hurting that was helpful? And then what was it that they did when you were hurting that wasn't so helpful?
Mm.
And they didn't mean it. It was unintentional, but it left you feeling unseen. And so that's where the bulk of our content came from, honestly, in addition to the research. So what we decided was we're going to put this in the book because of what our teenagers were telling us and because of what we know about culture. 60 to 80,000 thoughts is what we have approximately per day.
Wow.
And 80% of those thoughts are negative.
Mm.
And what we know is that there's a steady stream of negativity that, my goodness, it's the election cycle. Just look at that, right? All the
Yeah.
rhetoric, it's become so much more negative. There's negativity coming from pop culture. There's, of course, negativity coming from media and social media. And our kids are getting messages about who they are and who they aren't, that leaves them feeling like they're just not enough.
Yeah.
So it is so important to fight against that negativity bias, which we know that's a part of, brain development. It's so important to affirm our kids, to validate our kids. Depression and despair cause us to focus on the negative aspects of ourselves and other people. And so it's something that I tell parents, it's just important to do across all phases of life. It's important to do with our spouses. I always say that, my dad isn't, he's a West African educator. He's been a professor, a French professor for 40 years. He's now retired. He's very educated, but just based on how he grew up, mental health really wasn't a thing.
Right.
So he doesn't fully understand the ins and outs of the work that I do. But my goodness, every time I tell him that I'm on a plane or I'm sharing information about youth mental health, he says to me, I'm proud of you. So at my age, hearing that my parents are proud of me helps me to feel seen.
Yeah.
So speaking life, telling your kid out on that field, gosh, I saw your leadership when the score was going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And everybody's heads were down. I saw that you provided an uplift. I remember a teacher said to me about one of my kids, we had a new kid in the classroom, and I could tell that he felt really nervous, and Noah went over there and introduced himself. So sometimes we hear these things and we feel that sense of pride as aunts and uncles and grandparents and parents, but it's really important for our kids to know that you see the gifts that God has placed inside of them, right? Because that helps them to really hone and cultivate those gifts and helps them to feel confident.
I love how Mark Batterson says words create worlds, and we know that they can create worlds of hurt. But what
Yes.
you're mentioning is they can also create worlds of hope and healing, right? So make sure that we speak life into our kids every single day. Every kid deserves an attaboy or an attagirl. I'm proud of you. I love you. I
Yes.
care for you, and I'll always be here. Dr. Chinwé, as we close,
Mhm.
something I always love to do on the podcast is just
Yeah.
allowing our guests to have an opportunity to share just a pressing word that God has placed on their heart for such a time as this. And so
Mhm.
today, I would love for you to speak into the life of the mom or dad listening who maybe doesn't have the best relationship with their children, maybe feels a little discouraged or disappointed, maybe even disappointed in themselves up to this point. After hearing this, they're like, you know what? There's so much I could have done differently, or there's so much I could be doing now more, and it sounds exhausting. But what's just the last word of hope, encouragement, and motivation that you would leave that mom or dad with today?
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity. So, yes, we've all heard about youth mental health being, uh, just challenging. We've seen high rates of despair and anxiety like never before in modern history. And we know what God says, and we know the characteristic of God. God is love. And so I always share that there are approximately 8 billion people that are walking this earth, and God knows and loves each and every one of us. And the word in Luke chapter, I think it's chapter 12, verse 7 says that the Lord can count every single hair on our heads, right? So that's how much he knows us. That's how much he loves us. And God is love. And when we do just one of these things, and see, that's what I always want to caution parents against, is because we hear these things and it feels so big, so overwhelming in a world where we are preoccupied and so much is coming at us and so much is being demanded of us. It is very overwhelming to the nervous system. So I always share that when you do one of these things, lean into one that maybe you're already doing, and then just do it with even more intentionality and with even more consistency, and just see how it goes, right? Because God is love. And when we're demonstrating love and kindness and empathy to any one of his children that are hurting, we're then exercising a core part of who he is. So that's number one. Just limit it to like one thing.
Yeah.
And then the last word of encouragement is this word: repair. Repair. I have talked to too many families, Christian families, who have had ruptures in their relationships with their kids. And usually that happens in the adolescent phase of life. And then the parent, I talked to a pastor not too long ago who said, I haven't even really talked to my teenage son in a year, and they live under the same roof. And I'm sure if you heard their story, you would say the kid was disrespectful, or the kid shouldn't have said that, or the kid should have known the rules. But that really grieves my heart,
Yeah.
because talking to that parent who is a pastor, he is hurting.
Yeah.
He's hurting. And just depending on the culture that we grew up in, the family sort of thoughts and beliefs, we may think that it's not our role as parents to make things right. But I want to tell you that we need to make things right. And when there's ruptures, which there will be in any important relationship, just know that there's always the opportunity for repair. And repair basically means that after a conflict or after an argument, there is the process of resolving and rebuilding the relationship. And that is a necessary tool for conflict management, for relational management. And when you do initiate the repair, what you're doing is that you're teaching your kids that trust, confidence, and connection in relationships are important. And so that's something that they can carry with them throughout life. So I just want to encourage any parent that's hurting right now or feels unseen, that just because you are struggling does not mean that you are failing. And God absolutely loves you and sees you in this moment.
That's right. Mom or dad listening, we know you're tired. We know you have so much on your plate. But even if it's just one of those things, showing up, seeing your kids, listening, speaking life, right? even if it's just limiting it to one, that is more than enough. But then let's go on and, like you said, let's integrate and let's really initiate repair. That's such a powerful word to close us with. Dr. Chinwé Williams, where can our listeners and viewers go to find out more about you, but also to purchase the book that you've referenced several times? Its title is Seen: Despair and Anxiety in Kids and Teenagers and the Power of Connection. Where can we go?
Yeah, so my website is probably the one-stop shop for all of that and just to learn a little bit more about my work. And it's drchinwaywilliams.com. And also I'm on Instagram. I'm probably most active on that social media platform, and that's Chinwé Williams.
drchinwaywilliams.com. Thank you so much, Chinwé, just for who you are as a person, for your time, for your willingness to join me today. From all of us here at the AACC, and then just from our Built Different podcasting platform, we love you. We appreciate you. Thank you again for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. I love you all.